Hello, and welcome to this screencast on New Conflagrations, which is the title for Chapter 36 in Bentley and Ziegler's Traditions and Encounters, 5th edition. New Conflagrations is the title they use for the global conflicts of World War II and the Cold War that began in the 1930s. So we'll take a look at those things. Now, in this chapter, really the topics are focused on global conflicts and their consequences, which is one of the three key concepts in this time period. And I will focus on that and the language that surrounds that in the AP World History curriculum. It's worth noting, though, that the other two key concepts are very present here, and we'll kind of pull those out as we take a look. And you might use those if you were writing on, you might use World War II and Cold War examples if you're writing on either of those things. So, technology is obviously a key piece of the tremendous human cost for World War II and the Cold War. And then the third key concept about ideas about the world, how governments relate to their economies, how countries relate to each other, how people interpret the world as a global entity, like culturally, all those things are really big topics and they're deeply influenced by World War II and the Cold War. So you can also see World War II and the Cold War as key context for some of these other developments. The beginning of the war comes out of the post World War I settlement. That's the phrase that's used there. And so that's a way to say that it's more than just the Treaty of Versailles, because there's several treaties, and those treaties, it takes a little while for them to fall into place. A lot of historians will talk about a longer war or a greater war for World War I, like not ending all the way until 1923, as different parts of the conflict were settled through diplomacy and military action. So the post-World War I settlement means what's the world like after World War I? Some Japanese nationalists and militarists felt that they did not get enough influence in East Asia. As a result of that, of course, other East Asians felt like they got too much influence. There's the conflict. The other thing to say about militarism in Japan is that the aggressive militarists who control the Japanese government invade Manchuria and then the rest of China, bomb Pearl Harbor, basically create World War II in East Asia and the Pacific. Those people didn't gain firm control in the government of Japan until after the Great Depression had been underway for a couple years. So even though the actions taken by these militarists are directed at changing the post-World War I settlement, those militarists coming to power was contingent on, required context, the Great Depression, to make people desperate enough to support this, and for them to make arguments that they had to take radical action. We'll see that also with Germany, where without the Depression, the Nazis would not have come to power, and that would, or probably not, or at least the way it happened was contingent on the Great Depression. So it's not just the post-World War I settlement, it's also the Depression. Okay. So here we are in Europe with similar developments where Italy and Germany challenged the post-World War I settlement, specifically violating the treaties, intervening in the affairs of Spain in the Spanish Civil War, and then invading countries, in acts of really essentially imperialism. And in the case of the German Empire, or what Hitler called the Third German Empire, Reich means empire, they're really looking at a land empire with territory in Eastern Europe, kind of looking back to this sort of semi-mythic medieval past where German knights controlled huge, well, not huge, they thought it was huge, but controlled swaths of Eastern Europe. And also Germany at the end of World War I, where there's this in-between point where the German military controlled a huge chunk of territory from the Baltic to the Black Sea, like after Russia left the war, but before Germany was defeated, which was 18 months. So it wasn't like just a moment. It was 18 months. So we have that. A word that comes up with this is appeasement. Western democracies giving in order to avoid conflict. They have multiple reasons for that. You have to really do a kind of a country by country look. In the case of Britain, British generals or military officials were giving the political leadership the idea that they really wanted another year to prepare for war, that they should try to buy some time. in the case of France, once they knew that Britain and the United States weren't going to be there for them, they didn't want to go it alone against Germany. So they were appeasing. So, I mean, different countries have different reasons, but this word appeasement is a useful word to know. The Soviet Union, too, Russia had lost territory. So when you look at the invasion of Poland, which is the beginning of World War II in Europe, know that the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east at the same time. Here we see the city of Lvov or Lviv, or it has several names. It's a very diverse city. And just in the 20th century, it was part of Austria, part of Poland, and now it's part of the USSR and Ukraine. So it's a city that was in 4 different countries in 1 century. And 2 of those countries are empires that don't even exist anymore, the USSR and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the Soviet Union also was regaining territory that Russia had lost in Eastern Europe as part of the war. This is just one slide, and when I was looking at these before doing the screencast, there's part of me was like, well, I don't want to just glibly roll through this. So just maybe pause and take a moment. The human toll of World War II is truly horrific. There's some good infographics out there about it, and we can forget that, probably rivaled only by the great disease pandemics like the 1918, 1919 influenza, or the bubonic plague, the second plague pandemic of the Middle Ages, in terms of human costs. So you have a couple different things here that are related to technology. So the Blitzkrieg with planes and airplanes working together was not just costly in human lives, it was truly terrifying. People had not experienced this kind of thing before. Aerial bombardment was not really a World War I thing. It's first used in the 20s. The British did it in Iraq, put down uprisings there. The United States, the law enforcement in Tulsa used it against their own citizens. But it was a pretty new thing in history, especially at this, and neither of those things I mentioned, at the scale of things like the German invasion of Poland. We have that. There are examples there of 2 specific examples of atrocities, one by the Japanese in China, and the other, the British name for the German bombing of cities. Again, that would have been a new thing, these bombing of civilian areas. Okay. The third and fourth bullet points there are related. Strategic bombing is a good word to know. That bombing of civilians is strategic, which in this case means not tactical. It's not meant to win a particular battle or gain a certain advantage that then can be leveraged in something else. It's the strategy. The strategy means the bigger picture, which is to force a country, terrorize a country into surrendering. Typically is seen as not working until we get to the atomic bombing, meaning, when the Germans bombed London, it just made the British want to fight harder, gave Winston Churchill the opportunity to give some excellent speeches and, rile people up. But that's what strategic bombing is, although ultimately, you could say, the U.S. firebombing of Tokyo and atomic bombing does lead to the end of the war there. So that is an example of a place where the strategy succeeded, but you can see the extreme that had to be gone to for it to work. And then finally, I would say it's important to know that the German-Soviet War is more than half of the war, and the Holocaust happens inside of that. It's happening mostly in former Soviet or Polish territory. The killings. So if you just take that war by itself, it's bigger than any other war in history in cost of human life, including the rest of World War II. So really, that's where the fighting is. About almost 80% of German military casualties were inflicted by the Red Army of the Soviet Union. And that's interesting, not just as a fun fact, but it's going to have some real implications for what happens after the war. Some of the mass atrocities that happen in the war are committed directly onto civilian populations without any strategic military aim. And we'll see that most famously and horrifically in Europe with the Holocaust, the Shoah, and the network of camps and extermination centers, and just the horror of that. You'll also see the same. It's nothing like this, but you'll see some really horrific things done by the Japanese occupiers in East Asia and the Pacific too. And then there are war crimes committed by all people. So as the Soviet military moves across Eastern Europe and into Germany during the counter attack and the end of the war, the German defeat. There's a lot of documented cases of sexual assault committed by Soviet soldiers on German women, and you have that from soldiers from all the warring countries, Allied and Axis, and lots of theaters of the war. The Holocaust, of course, is in a category kind of unto itself in its organization and destructiveness and horror. So keep that in mind. Okay. And then finally, World War II gave way to the Cold War. And this will also be a big topic in chapter 37 and a little bit into 38, which is the last chapter. So the Cold War, as you think about this, it's important to know that the Cold War refers to a series of events. It's not one thing. It's a label that was first used in the 1940s, late 40s, like 47, 48, by an American journalist to describe the maneuvering for position between the former allies and now antagonists. He said, well, they used to be allies, the US and Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, but now there seems to be a Cold War developing where they're trying to outmaneuver each other. So then that label has stuck and refers to events from right after World War II all the way through 1989 to 1991. So that's a long time. So you have to know that this is a label. It's like referring to an era. It's like saying, the Roaring 20s. It's not just one thing. It's a lot of different things that fall underneath that label. Okay. Some of those events are violent, and that's important for American students who learn about the Cold War, usually through the lens of the arms race. And the original phrase Cold War meaning they weren't directly fighting each other. In a world history class, you're going to see a lot of fighting happening around the world that's made more damaging by the superpowers supporting either side. And some of that will directly involve the superpowers, like the Soviet soldiers who fought in Afghanistan, Americans who fought and served in other ways in Korea and Vietnam. So we have some connection to that as Americans. Speaking as an American teacher, but we can overemphasize the nonviolent part in terms of learning what the word is and thinking about American fears of nuclear war and things like that, because for a lot of people, like the people in Korea, like way more Koreans died than Americans, and so many more Southeast Asian people died than Americans in the wars in Vietnam, that the war really is quite violent in parts of the world. So you have to kind of it's a series of events, and some of them are violent, and some of them are not. These events, what they have in common is some division of the world, either into communist and capitalist. Americans will stress the democracy part of it, but they always choose capitalism and are kind of ambivalent about whether or not democracy is required. But they always choose anti-communism. So you can really think of it as communist and anti-communist that way, as an ideology or in terms of alliances. Okay, so ideologically, and here capitalism is evolving capitalism's always evolving. But what I was going to say is communism is evolving in meaning, communism before the revolutions and even during the revolutions in the Soviet Union and in China were, that it wasn't, it could have meant a few different things. For instance, the theoretical writings of communism they're not militaristic, but in real life, the Soviet Union and then later the People's Republic of China are very militaristic. And that's because of events. With the Soviet Union, really the thing that they can tell their citizens is we won World War II. And so that really, after World War II, then the military is a source, and then during the Cold War, is a real source of pride and identification for the communist regime, a way they try to gain legitimacy with their students, with their citizens. So kind of looking for that. You'll see lots of different examples of propaganda, and it's pretty common kind of question, to look at propaganda and then try to break down what's happening in it. And that could be American commercial advertising, or it could be the propaganda of the one-party totalitarian states in Soviet Union, Eastern Europe. Okay. That idea. So we see this map here is a division of Europe into two alliances. So you see the Soviet Union there and its allies known as the Warsaw Pact, because it was signed in Warsaw, which you see there in Poland. And that's basically the territory that the Soviet Union occupied at the end of World War II after defeating Germany. You can see Germany itself got divided in two. By the way, don't fall into the trap that Germany was treated more leniently after World War II because West Germany got Marshall Plan money. I mean, that is true, but after World War I, Germany was not divided in two, was not reduced as much in size, did not have its factories carted off to Russia, as happened in East Germany, and the United States is still occupying West Germany. There's, I don't know, 30,000 U.S. Army troops in Germany right now. So Germany has reemerged in the post-war world as a powerful economic unit and a country that has a lot going for it, but they were dismantled after World War II, and really a smoldering pile of rubble in a lot of cases. As I said, with the Marshall Plan, the United States will use aid in the Soviet Union, but to a lesser extent as a less wealthy country to do that. These wars in places like Vietnam and Korea can be thought of as proxy wars, where you have two sides fighting that are proxies for the US and the Soviet Union. And finally, there's a lot of this we're learning about now. The history of the Cold War is very interesting, actually, right now, because it's recent, but it's getting far enough away that there's more documents that are coming out. And with the demise of the Soviet Union, there's things that historians can look at that they couldn't look at, even 25 years ago, or had trouble getting to, or certainly 30 years ago, would have had trouble getting at when the Soviet Union still existed. So we have all those things happening. Now, this is really an introduction, and a lot of the things that I mentioned here will actually happen in chapter 37, but your book's going to look at the beginnings of the Cold War in this chapter. All right, so happy reading. And if you are here and have done the reading, you are almost done. We just have 2 more chapters after this, so we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.